Good morning, students. Today we are going to start motor nervous system. We have completed the sensory nervous system including the special senses. So we will proceed with the motor nervous system. So ability to move is an essential feature of animal life. Locomotion or movement is crucial for survival of organisms. So the motor system deals with study of physiology of movement, which involves initiation, execution and control of movements. For any movement to be appropriately carried out, a stable and maintained posture is the basic necessity. So with the help of stable postural background and with appropriate postural adjustments, coordinate movement becomes possible. So for the coordinated movements to take place, the spinal reflexes are very important. So that is our today's topic, spinal reflexes. The learning objectives for today's class are Introduction, Reflex arc, Classification of reflexes, the stretch reflex, inverse stretch reflex, withdrawal reflex and general properties of reflexes. So out of these, the stretch reflex, inverse stretch and withdrawal of reflex or withdrawal reflex, these are very important topics. So both for understanding the concept you should know, and also for exam purpose these are very important short questions or very short questions. General properties of reflexes also very important for understanding the reflexes topic. And coming to the definitions, reflex is a rapid involuntary response to a stimulus which depends on integrity of reflex pathway, that is the reflex arc. And spinal reflex is defined as stereotyped motor response to a specific stimulus like stretch of the muscle. So the stimulus is stretch of the muscle and the response produced is motor response, that is movement. So reflex arc. This reflex arc components are receptor, sensory neuron, integration center, motor neuron and effector. So the receptor is site of stimulus. It is present at the site of stimulus. Sensory or afferent neuron, that is it transmits afferent impulses to the central nervous system. And integration center, it is monosynaptic or polysynaptic region within CNS. That is the integration between the afferent neuron and the neurons within the central nervous system. So it may be monosynaptic or polysynaptic. That means the synapse between the afferent neuron and the integrating neuron in the central nervous system. That may be one synapse or more than one synapse. And motor neuron or efferent neuron, it conducts impulses, efferent impulses from integration center to the effector organ. And finally, effector organ is a muscle fiber or gland that responds to efferent impulse. So this is the basic concept for any reflex to take place. So these components should be or must be present for the reflex to take place. That is the starting from the stimulus to the effect. Okay, so receptor, sensory or afferent neuron, integration center or the center, and then motor or efferent neuron and effector organ. And you can see in the pictorial form, this is the receptor, the site of stimulus. Suppose pricked by a needle, the receptor's free nerve endings will be activated and they will be carrying the impulse. So this blue colored one is the afferent or sensory neuron and in the spinal cord. Okay, so this is a synapse between the afferent neuron and the integrating center, or we can call it as interneuron. And so here it is having only one synapse. From this again the efferent neuron is passing out, or motor neuron, and it is supplying the effector organ, that will be the muscle. So this complete circuit is called reflex arc. Okay, so the stimulus, sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron and the muscle. So this is the classification of reflexes. So they can be classified by development, that is innate from the birth itself. The reflexes are present which are genetically determined, and some reflexes are learned as a child grows, that is acquired reflexes. And the classification by response produced will be somatic reflexes and visceral or autonomic reflexes. Somatic means superficial, that is they control the skeletal muscle contractions, which include superficial and stretch reflexes. And visceral or autonomic reflexes, they control the actions of smooth and cardiac muscles, glands and adipose tissue. And complexity of the circuit, they can be classified into monosynaptic having one synapse and polysynaptic having multiple synapses, that is more than one, two to several hundred. And the processing site, the reflexes classified by processing site, they are spinal and cranial reflexes. Spinal means processed in the spinal cord and cranial means processing occurring in the brain. Okay, so we have four types of classifications: innate and acquired, somatic and visceral, monosynaptic and polysynaptic, spinal and cranial. So the one which we are going to deal now is the stretch reflex, which will be the monosynaptic reflex. And these stretch reflexes, which are somatic reflexes, these for these examples are the knee jerk, biceps jerk, that is the deep tendon reflexes. So that we will see in the practical examination. So coming to stretch reflex, the reflex contraction of muscle to stretch when a skeletal muscle with intact nerve supply is stretched is called stretch reflex. So these definitions are very important. The previous slide I have shown you the reflex and spinal reflex. So those two definitions, and now stretch reflex. The stretch reflex is reflex contraction of muscle to stretch. Okay, so stretch will be the stimulus, contraction of muscle will be a response. So this is taking place when a skeletal muscle with intact nerve supply is stretched. So that is called stretch reflex. Two types of stretch reflex are present, phasic and tonic. So phasic means it is elicited by stimulating the primary endings of the muscle spindle. So sudden stretch of the muscle. So if we give the sudden stretch of muscle, we will see the phasic stretch reflex, and tonic stretch reflex is elicited by sustained stretch of a muscle. Okay, so that main difference is here for sustained stretch, this phasic stretch is sudden stretch of the muscle will be the stimulus, and tonic means sustained stretch of the muscle. So tone means what? Resistant to continued resistant to muscle contraction is muscle tone. So for sustained stretch, the reflex produced will be the tonic stretch reflex. Stretch reflex is more important in large extensor muscles. So these extensor muscles of the back which sustain the upright posture. So the muscles of back helps in maintaining the posture. So this is very important in those muscles. Contractions of postural muscles of spine are almost continuously regulated by the stretch reflexes. So this is a simple pictorial representation of a stretch reflex. So for that you should know the muscle spindle. So muscle spindle is nothing but the receptor of a muscle which is present deeply in the muscle. So this muscle spindle is a separate class for you, which will be dealt in the tomorrow's class. Stretching of muscle stimulates the muscle spindle. It causes activation of sensory neuron and it integrates in the spinal cord, information processing at the motor neuron, and then activation of motor neuron, which will cause the final response, that is the contraction of muscle, the same muscle. Okay, so muscle spindle is present inside, that is the muscle can be divided into intrafusal and extrafusal fibers. So in the intrafusal, the muscle spindle will be present. So the efferent neuron starts from there and final integrates in the center, and then the efferent neuron supplies the extrafusal muscle fibers, so which will produce the muscle contraction. So the stretch reflex. In the pictorial form, you can see here the biceps muscle, which is stretch. That is the stimulus, fast stretch of the muscle. And the biceps muscle spindle, the sense organ, that is the spindle, is excited. 1A and 2 sensory neurons are activated. So 1A and 2 sensory neurons are the afferent neurons of the muscle spindle. So these fibers will go and integrate in the spinal cord, and then the efferent neurons will come out and give the biceps muscle the response. So primary response is muscle that is stretched contracts rapidly. So the biceps is contracting here. So the differences between the phasic and tonic stretch reflex. So reflex contraction of muscle in response to sudden stretch, that is the phasic stretch reflex. And the tonic stretch reflex is elicited by the sustained stretch of the muscle. So this contributes to muscle tone, which is nothing but resistance of muscle to stretch. And the phasic reflex contraction results in rapid limb movement. And this tonic stretch reflex, it is important for regulation of posture by maintaining the muscle tone. The phasic stretch reflex examples are tendon reflexes like knee reflex and biceps reflex. And this phasic stretch reflex ensures immediate correction of the spinal motor output. So from the spinal cord and the motor output which is coming out, if there is any error in that, this phasic stretch reflex corrects immediately. And the tonic stretch reflex helps in maintaining the posture for very long period. Suppose a person standing, like conductors and constables, traffic police, so they will be standing for very long period. So there comes the importance of tonic stretch reflex in the long muscles of lower limbs. And some other components of stretch reflex. It excites synergist muscles. That is, the spindle efferents also make excitatory monosynaptic connections with synergist muscles. So you know the meaning of synergist and antagonist, agonist and antagonist. So synergist or agonist muscles are they act along with the, or they respond facilitatively or positively, that is flexor response, and antagonist means opposite response, so they will relax instead of contracting. So here the stretch reflex excites the synergist muscles. Okay, so this red colored one is the flexor group of muscles, so it is exciting, giving supply to the flexor group of muscles. And then it inhibits the antagonist muscles, so that is reciprocal inhibition. So here you can see polysynaptic. So this is the example of polysynaptic. So but the stretch reflex will be coming under single monosynaptic. So this supply, only this one we should consider as a stretch reflex. So this other two are the components of stretch reflex. So it is giving supply to the other flexor muscle also and other extensor muscle. So this is called reciprocal inhibition. Spindle activity also excites interneurons that make inhibitory synapses on the motor neurons to antagonistic muscles. So these are the antagonistic muscles. So this will be having the inhibition. So it inhibits the antagonistic muscle triceps, and it excites the synergist muscle brachialis, so that when the muscle is, or when the limb is flexing, this should not be in active contraction phase. So this antagonist muscle, that is triceps, it should be in relaxing phase so that the flexion of the muscle takes place. So these are the other components of stretch reflex. So stretch or myotatic reflex is monosynaptic reflex. So if we consider the example of knee jerk, in knee jerk we will tap over the knee patella, the tendon below the patella, and the response produced is extension of the lower limb and the contraction of quadriceps muscles. So when the muscle is stretched, the stretching stimulates group 1A efferent fibers of the muscle spindle of the quadriceps muscles. So these efferent synapse directly on the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord. The pool of alpha motor neurons activated innervates the homonymous muscle, that is the same quadriceps muscle from where the stimulus is or the efferent fibers are produced. And the stimulation of alpha motor neuron causes contraction in the muscle that was stretched. As the muscle contracts, it shortens, decreasing the stretch on the muscle spindle and returning to its original length. At the same time, synergist muscles are activated and antagonist muscles are inhibited. Okay, so don't worry about all these things, efferents, alpha motor neurons. So these will be coming in the coming classes. So stretching of the muscle, it activates the muscle spindle. It excites the gamma motor neurons of the spindle, causing stretched muscle to contract. So gamma motor neurons are nothing but efferent neurons. The efferent impulses from the spindle result in inhibition of antagonist group of muscles. So for this, the example is patellar reflex or any deep reflexes. So tapping the patellar tendon stretches the quadriceps, starting the reflex action. And the quadriceps contract and the antagonistic hamstring muscles will be relaxed. So this is the stretch reflex or patellar reflex example. It excites the muscle, that is the contraction of the muscle which is stretched, that is suppose here example is quadriceps. So this will be contracted, and whereas the hamstring muscles, so that is the opposite muscles, antagonistic muscles will relax. So this is one of the important property of a reflex. So that is nothing but treponent action. So when one group of muscles are active, the other group of muscles are inhibited, so that specific action, that is a flexion or extension, will be taking place. So this is the pictorial representation of again a stretch reflex. In the muscle, we are having a muscle spindle. From that, the stretch, the stimulus is for the stretch stimulus. The afferent fibers are activated. They will be going into the spinal cord integrating center, and from there the efferent impulses to alpha motor neuron causes contraction of the stretched muscle that resists or reverses the stretch. So the muscle which resists or reverses the stretch, that will be contracted. And again at the same time the interneurons, inhibitory interneurons will be activated, that will send efferent impulses to antagonistic muscles, causing reciprocal inhibition. And the same thing in this picture we can see the patellar reflex. So when the knee hammer, when the patellar tendon is tapped, so that will cause contraction of the quadriceps. So this is quadriceps and the lower one is the hamstring. Okay, so these are the extensor group and these are the flexor group. So this will be contracted and this will be inhibited. And these stretch reflexes can be modulated and modified, that is change in the damage and disease. So reflexes can be modulated by presynaptic inhibition of 1A terminals. This can reduce the amount of transmitter release at the synapse upon motor neuron and dampen the monosynaptic reflexes. So these can be modulated by presynaptic inhibition of 1A terminals. This can reduce the amount of transmitter. So we have seen the presynaptic inhibition in our synapse class, no? So the 1A terminals are going into the spinal cord. Here what will happen? The presynaptic inhibition by reducing the amount of transmitter release and dampening the monosynaptic reflex. So the activities of motor neurons can be decreased by inhibitory inputs. So the changes in reflexes are symptomatic. In general, decreased stretch reflex can indicate lower motor neuron disorder, and increased stretch reflex can indicate upper motor neuron syndromes or diseases. So the lower motor neuron and upper motor neurons are nothing but the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord. From the alpha motor neurons to above, that is to spinal cord or the to the stimulus point or the central nervous system. The muscle neurons from the central nervous system to the alpha motor neuron is the upper motor neuron, and whereas the lower motor neuron, the nerves from the lower motor or alpha motor neuron to the effector organ. So that will be the lower motor neuron. So these upper and lower motor neurons are also considered in the coming classes. The function of stretch reflex is maintaining balance when standing. So for maintaining balance when standing, so not only the stretch reflex is important, along with it the vestibular apparatus and the cerebellum, basal ganglia, all those should function in cooperation to maintain the balance when a person is standing. So suppose the test, if we perform, the person standing on a moving platform, he will be tilted forwards. So the hamstring muscles, quadriceps and gastrocnemius, all those will be coming into action while moving, while the person is tilting forward. So tilting forward stretches the muscles on back of leg. So the muscles will be rapidly contracted. So gastrocnemius will be excited first. And however, the responses are longer in duration than stretch reflex, and they activate extensor muscles of the back and change when wearing a backpack. And these responses change when wearing a backpack because the back will carry the load influenced by other sensory inputs. So this is one more example. When stretch reflexes are active, unexpected perturbations that lead to stretch of any skeletal muscle will cause muscles to contract. Example, pouring fluid into glass increases weight, stretching the biceps muscle. So this is the example, same like wearing a backpack on the back muscles. It will cause increasing the weight, again increasing the weight or load on the muscle causes stretching of that muscle. Okay, when the stretch reflexes are active, unexpected perturbations, so these are unexpected perturbations, lead to stretch of any skeletal muscle, will cause muscle to contract. So here there is empty glass, so normal stretch reflex is present, and pouring fluid in glass stretches the biceps. So this will cause stretching of the biceps, causing again the stimulus afferent is going, contraction of the same muscle. Stretch reflex causes biceps contraction. And now we will see the higher control of this stretch reflex. So what are the facilitatory and inhibitory areas of motor control or the stretch reflex control? So we can see here the negative signs are there and the positive signs are there. Positive means facilitatory areas. So areas, this is the example of cat brain where stimulation produces facilitation and inhibition of stretch reflexes. So first one is motor cortex, which is inhibitory. Second is basal ganglia, again inhibitory. Third is cerebellum, inhibitory. And four is inhibitory reticular area. And fifth is reticular facilitated area. This entire one is the reticular facilitated area. And sixth is the vestibular nuclei, the small one here. So this is facilitatory. So this picture is also very important for this will be coming under regulation of muscle tone and also higher control of stretch reflex. So you should remember this for in entire central nervous system. If you understand this, you will easily get the concept, or you can tell any reflex, anything. So the first one, we will see the facilitatory areas. In that, the pontine reticular nuclei, these are located posteriorly and laterally in the pons and extending to the mesencephalon. So this will be the brainstem in the pons. It is located laterally extending to the mesencephalon. They transmit excitatory or facilitatory signals down into the spinal cord. And then the vestibular. These control the excitatory signals to the different anti-gravity muscles to maintain equilibrium in response to signals from vestibular apparatus. Okay, so vestibular nuclei, so this will carry vestibulospinal tract. So these will send selective excitatory signals to different anti-gravity muscles to maintain equilibrium. And The properties of the facilitated area, that is pontine reticular and vestibular nuclei, they terminate on the motor neurons that excite anti-gravity muscles of the body, so like muscles of vertebral column and extensor muscles of the limbs. They have higher degree of natural or spontaneous excitability. They receive strong excitatory signals from vestibular nuclei and deep nuclei of cerebellum. They cause powerful excitation of anti-gravity muscles throughout the body. That is, they facilitate a standing position supporting the body against gravity. So remember these properties. They terminate on motor neurons that excites the anti-gravity muscles, and they have higher degree of natural, that is spontaneous excitability. So this is inbuilt, natural or inborn property of the facilitatory centers. They receive strong excitatory signals from vestibular nuclei and deep nuclei of cerebellum, and they cause powerful excitation of anti-gravity muscles. And coming to the inhibitory areas, these are medullary reticular system. So here you can see medullary reticular system. They extend the entire extend to the medulla, lying ventrally and medially near the middle part. They transmit inhibitory signals to same anti-gravity anterior motor neurons or medullary reticulospinal tract. The pontine reticulospinal tract is facilitatory, whereas the medullary reticulospinal tract is inhibitory. So remember these two, reticulospinal and vestibulospinal, are very important extrapyramidal tracts which will control the stretch reflex and also posture. These inhibitory areas receive collaterals from corticospinal tract, the rubrospinal and other motor pathways. So these collaterals activate the medullary reticular inhibitory system to balance the excitatory signals from the pontine reticular system, so that under normal conditions the body muscles are normally tense. Okay, so this is the basic thing. The normally all body muscles are continuously or constantly they are under tension or the normal muscle tone. So that is because of these that is collaterals from corticospinal and other motor pathways, and also the medullary reticular inhibitory system and balancing the excitatory pontine reticular system. So proceeding to the next reflex, that is Golgi tendon reflex or inverse stretch reflex or inverse myotatic reflex. So inverse means the opposite. So opposite of stretch reflex. So that's why the name Golgi tendon reflex or inverse stretch reflex. So it is produced by contracting the muscle which activates the Golgi tendon organs. So Golgi tendons organs are present in the tendon of the muscle. So in the muscle we have the muscle spindle, that is receptor for muscle. They will be first activated by the stretch of the muscle and then the contraction of muscle takes place. So likewise in the tendon of the muscle there is Golgi tendon organ. So these are receptors for this Golgi tendon reflex. So the efferent Golgi tendon neurons get stimulated. These neurons inhibit the contracting muscles. So the antagonistic muscle will be activated. In stretch reflex, antagonistic muscle will be inhibited, but in inverse stretch reflex, antagonistic muscle will be activated and the actual muscle will be inhibiting the contraction. The contracting muscle will be relaxed and the antagonistic contracts. So activated means contracts. So it is a disynaptic reflex. The stretch reflex is monosynaptic, but the Golgi tendon or inverse stretch reflex is disynaptic. So it is the opposite or inverse of stretch reflex. The active muscle contraction stimulates the Golgi tendon organs and group 1B efferent fibers. So there for stretch reflex we have 1A efferent fibers. Here we have 1B efferent fibers. So this efferent stimulates the inhibitory interneurons in the spinal cord. So these interneurons inhibit the alpha motor neurons and cause relaxation of the muscle that was originally contracted. At the same time, antagonist muscles are excited. So this is exactly the opposite of stretch reflex. So you can see here the muscle, this is the spindle and the Golgi tendon is the present in tendon part of the muscle. So this is the belly of the muscle, this is the tendon. So from here the 1B afferents will be entering the spinal cord. They will cause inhibition. Inhibitory interneurons are activated. That will cause the efferent nerves. So the efferent nerves will be supplying the muscle. So this muscle will be relaxed. The response is relaxation of this muscle, and the other antagonistic muscle will be present now. So the one more efferent neuron or motor nerve will supply that muscle, and that muscle will be contracted. So autogenic inhibition. So this is nothing but relaxation of muscles in response to strong stretch is called inverse reflex, and that is known as autogenic inhibition. Auto means the same, from which muscle the response, the contracting muscle tendon, the reflex is activated. So the same mother muscle will be inhibited. So that's why it is called autogenic inhibition. The stimulus for this reflex is large force exerted on the muscle tendon. Suppose heavy weight, 1000 lbs weight is exerted or kept on the limb, that will cause exertion of the tendon. So the sense organ Golgi tendon is excited, and the primary response is muscle attached to the tendon will be relaxed. So the muscle attached to the tendon, this is the same muscle. So this will be relaxed. That means its tension will be inhibited. So it is called autogenic inhibition. So the primary response is Golgi tendon organ producing the sensory neuron that will be activating the inhibitory interneuron. So this will be inhibiting the supply. The signal transmission will be inhibited, or it will not be transmitted from to the motor neuron and finally to the muscle. So the primary response is the synapses here are polysynaptic, that is more than one synapse is involved. So the 1B sensory neuron make the excitatory synapse onto the interneuron. Interneuron makes inhibitory synapse onto the motor neuron, decreasing the firing. And the other effects of this autogenic inhibition are the inhibition of synergistic, as we all have already seen in the previous slide, and excitation of antagonistic. So the antagonistic muscle gets excited. It makes excitatory synapse on the interneuron, which causes the antagonistic muscle to contract. For this, the example is classified reflex. In upper motor neuron lesion, tonus increases, or the muscle tone increase. Resistance to stretch increases. So if sufficient force is applied, limb resistance suddenly decreases, like pocket knife snapping shut. So the pocket knife, if you know the example of a pocket knife, that knife will be having the pocket. From that, initially when you put the knife inside the pocket, initially there will be some resistance, but as you go on putting, suddenly that resistance is lost and the knife will be easily entering into the pocket. So that is called snapping shut. So if the sufficient force is applied, limb resistance suddenly decreases, giving way. Suddenly the limb gives way to the stimulus. Sufficient force will be the stimulus. So suddenly the muscle will be relaxed or contracted. So this is the classified reflex is seen in upper motor neuron lesion. So this again we will see in the coming slides. So but for now here you see that the autogenic inhibition, we have inhibition of synergistic muscles and excitation of antagonistic muscles. So the classified reflex is an exaggerated form of Golgi tendon reflex, which can occur with disease of corticospinal tracts, that is hypertonicity or spasticity. It is an exaggerated form of Golgi tendon reflex, which can occur with disease of corticospinal tracts. So hypertonicity will be present. For example, if the arm is hypertonic, the increased sensitivity of the muscle spindles in the extensor muscles causes resistance to flexion of the arm. Eventually, the tension in the triceps increases to the point at which it activates the Golgi tendon reflex, causing the triceps to relax and the arm to flex, close like a jackknife. Okay, so this jackknife or pocket knife is an example. So consider this example again. If the arm is hypertonic, consider the arm is hypertonic, that is increased tone is present. Increased sensitivity of the muscle spindles in the extensor, that is triceps muscle, causes resistance to flexion. So the hypertonia is present in extensor muscles, so that will be causing resistance to flexion because the extensor muscles are continuously in contraction phase, so which will cause resistance to flexion. But eventually the tension in triceps increases to the point at which it activates the Golgi tendon reflex. So in the triceps, the Golgi tendon will be activated, causing the triceps to relax, and suddenly the flexion movement will be taking place. So that is, the arm will be suddenly flexed. Like that sudden flexion is exactly like closing of a knife into the pocket, that is otherwise called jackknife. Okay, so if you don't understand here again, you can see a video. Okay, in YouTube you can open the you can type the clasp knife reflex, you can see the animated video there. So it is sudden relaxation of the triceps muscle causing the arm to flex, like exactly like closing of a jackknife. So when the muscles are hypertonic, the sequence of moderate stretch muscle contraction, the strong stretch muscle relaxation is clearly seen. Okay, the sequence of stretch muscle contraction and muscle relaxation is clearly seen. The passive flexion of the elbow, for example, meets immediate resistance as a result of stretch reflex in the triceps muscle, and the further stretch activates the inverse stretch reflex. The resistance to flexion suddenly collapses and the arm flexes. So this is again the same description. So continued passive flexion stretches the muscle again and the sequence may be repeated. This sequence of resistance followed by giveaway when limb is moved passively is known as clasp knife effect because of its resemblance to closing of a pocket knife. It is also known as lengthening reaction because it is the response of a spastic muscle to lengthening. So this lengthening reaction is very important term here. So it is related to the clasp knife effect. Okay, so this clasp knife effect is present only when the muscles are hypertonic. So this is not normal. It is not normally present only in the upper motor neuron lesion. When the muscles are hypertonic, this entire thing takes place. That is, when the force is increased, the triceps muscle will be activated by the inverse stretch reflex. It will be relaxed and there will be sudden giveaway. The sequence of resistance followed by giveaway when the limb is passively moved is known as clasp knife effect, and this clasp knife effect is possible by lengthening reaction. That is, some part is the sequence, that is when the muscle is moved, some part is flexed and again this triceps muscle will be again contracted and some part there will be resistance and again the giveaway will be present, again flexion will take place. So that will be taking place in a lengthening, some part flexion, some part flexion, like that. It is a lengthening reaction. Okay, and now so we have seen the stretch reflex and inverse stretch reflex. So reflex testing is a powerful clinical tool. So in a clinical test, apply stimulus 1. So stimulus, if we apply a stimulus and we will see to get a response. So that is a reflex testing, applying the stimulus and looking for a response. For reflex to occur, all elements must be functional. That is, the pathways must be intact. So this, starting from the stimulus to the effector organ, the pathway should be intact. Anywhere any damage is present, the reflex cannot be elicited. If this reflex is absent, diagnose where the pathway is interrupted and if abnormal, diagnose where the pathway is compromised. Okay, so for reflex or for central nervous system examination, the reflex testing is very important. So some of the reflexes elicited are abdominal reflex. So we elicit, the stimulus is given and the response is seen. Some are the somatic reflexes like abdominal biceps. If we tap over the tendon, the contraction of biceps will be present, seen. And same like for triceps. If we tap on the triceps tendon, the reflex of contraction of the triceps will be seen. And also the ankle jerk. If we tap on the ankle, the tendon of the hamstring muscles, the response seen is extension of the ankle. And testing for the clonus. So this clonus is also a abnormal thing, which is a regular rhythmic contraction of a muscle when subjected to sudden and maintained stretch. So the best example is ankle clonus. So this is elicited by dorsiflexing the foot and trying to maintain the dorsiflexion, resulting in rhythmic plantar flexion at the ankle. So this is also seen in the upper motor neuron paralysis, in which the spindles are hyperactive. So the examiner is flexing the foot, that is dorsiflexing, and trying to maintain its flexion, resulting in rhythmic plantar flexion at the ankle. Okay, so plantar flexion. This is dorsiflexion and this will be the plantar flexion, the opposite movement. So this will be seen in upper motor neuron paralysis. And this is clasp knife. So when the muscle is hypertonic, when the person is trying to flex the limb, initially there will be resistance and some part it will be flexed, and again there will be resistance, again flex, again resistance. So that will be clasp knife. Suddenly there will be a giveaway that will cause some part of flexion to take place, and again there will be resistance, again some part will be flexed. Like that the movement will be present in parts. So that is clasp knife reflex. And lastly, coming to the flexor withdrawal reflex and crossed extensor reflex. So the flexor withdrawal reflex is initiated by painful stimulus, which is actual or perceived stimulus. The automatic withdrawal of threatened body part will be the response. So the stimulus is painful stimulus, which is actual or perceived, and the response is automatic withdrawal of the threatened body part. And crossed extensor reflex, we have two parts. One is stimulated side withdrawn. The limb which is stimulated, that side will be withdrawn, and the other side or contralateral or opposite side of limb will be extended. The flexor withdrawal reflex is a polysynaptic reflex. So we have seen monosynaptic stretch reflex, disynaptic Golgi tendon or inverse stretch reflex, and now a polysynaptic reflex, which is flexor withdrawal reflex. It results in flexion of ipsilateral side and extension on the contralateral side. Somatosensory and pain efferent fibers elicit withdrawal of the stimulated body part from noxious or painful stimulus. So the pain stimulus, actual or passive stimulus, is pain. Example, touching a hot stove or hot pot. It stimulates flexor reflex efferents of groups 2, 3 and 4. The efferent fibers synapse polysynaptically onto the motor neurons in the spinal cord. On ipsilateral side of pain stimulus, flexors are stimulated, that is they contract, and extensors are inhibited, and the arm is jerked away from the stove. And on the contralateral side or opposite side limb, the flexors are inhibited and extensors are stimulated, that is crossed extension reflex, to maintain the balance. As a result, persistent neural activity in polysynaptic circuits and after discharge occurs. So this after discharge prevents the muscle from relaxing for some time. Okay, so you can understand this by seeing a picture. So this is painful stimulus. The same leg will be stimulated, that is it is withdrawn. The flexors are stimulated stimulated so that the limb can contract, and the extensors are inhibited. Okay, so the limb is withdrawn from the painful stimulus. And this picture, you can see the crossed extensor in the spinal cord. This picture is very important. You see here, one is supplying the same muscle, that is the painful stimulated muscle. Here the flexors are stimulated, extensors inhibited. And on the opposite side or other limb, the extensors are stimulated and flexors are inhibited. So the opposite reaction is taking place. So this limb is lifted and this limb is contracted. The extensor muscles are stimulated to maintain the balance. When one limb is lifted, it should be in position, contracting position. So some features of withdrawal reflex are, it is a protective reflex because it protects the body parts or the person from damage caused by a potential or harmful stimulus. So flexion of the stimulated limb withdraws the limb, and extension of the opposite limb supports or balances the body. And the pattern of response of flexor withdrawal reflex depends on nature and location of the stimulus. For example, abduction occurs when the medial surface of the limb is stimulated, and adduction of the limb occurs when lateral surface is stimulated. It is also called local sign. Okay, the pattern of response of flexor withdrawal reflex, it depends on nature and location of stimulus. So when abduction occurs when medial surface of limb is stimulated, and adduction occurs when lateral surface of the limb is stimulated. So that is local sign. And after discharge, that is, a stronger stimulus not only causes widespread response but also prolonged response. So this prolonged response is due to repeated firing of the target motor neurons, which is called after discharge. So this takes place by two mechanisms. That is, one is involvement of many interneuronal pathways and presence of reverberating circuits. So reverberating circuits means, again, the branches of interneurons project onto the other interneurons, which will project back onto the same interneurons. So this stimulation of interneurons reverberates, that circuit is being repeatedly present. So therefore the neurons will be repeatedly stimulated. So this is again one more picture showing the flexor reflex and the extensor reflex. So excites the synergistic muscle, flexors on the same leg, and inhibit the antagonistic muscles, inhibit the extensor in the same leg. This is the flexor response. And crossed extension reflexes excite extensors and inhibit flexors in the opposite leg. The function is other leg provides support when the first leg is lifted. Okay, one will be flexed and other will be extended to support the body. So the summary of muscle reflexes we have seen today: stretch reflex, Golgi tendon, and flexor withdrawal reflex. So there's number of synapses in each of the reflexes, and stimulus for every reflex is stretching of the muscle, and the reflex for Golgi tendon is muscle contraction, and for flexor withdrawal the pain will be the stimulus. And afferent fibers are 1A, 1B and 2, 3, 4 in flexor reflex. And the response in stretch reflex is contraction of muscle, and Golgi tendon reflex response is relaxation, and flexor withdrawal is ipsilateral flexion and contralateral extension. So if you remember this table, easily you can write about any reflex. So these three reflexes are very important, which will come as short question. And again, this is a detailed description or summary of all the three reflexes which we have seen today. So these reflexes are important tools. Behaviors are more complex and can incorporate, change and adapt reflex connections. Okay, so once have a look on this table and write on your notebook. And these spinal reflexes form part of automatic reactions and adjustments, maintaining balance when standing and walking by muscle spindles, and regulating muscle tensions, that is not damaging the muscles or insertions by Golgi tendon organs, and stepping on a nail, avoiding a painful stimuli, is a flexor withdrawal reflex, that is cutaneous nociceptive pain receptors are the stimulators. And automatic reactions differ from reflexes in duration, complexity, and can be influenced by different types of sensory inputs. So the lastly, properties of reflexes. The first and most important is adequate stimulus. So for any reflex to take place, the adequate stimulus should be present. The stimulus that triggers a reflex is generally very precise. So this stimulus is called adequate for that particular reflex. So for the particular flexor withdrawal reflex, the stimulus should be pain. Okay, that is the adequate stimulus for flexor withdrawal, and also stretch is the adequate stimulus for stretch reflex. Final common path. The motor neurons that supply the extrafusal fibers in skeletal muscle or the efferent side of many reflex arcs. All neural influences affecting the muscle contraction ultimately funnel through them to the muscles, and therefore they are called the final common paths. So the alpha motor neurons which are present in the ventral horn of the spinal cord are the final common paths, because all the efferent fibers, that is the neural influences affecting the muscle contractions, ultimately funnel through the alpha motor neurons to the muscles. So these are the efferent motor neurons. So otherwise they are called final common paths. Central excitatory and inhibitory states. The spinal cord also shows prolonged changes in excitability, possibly because of activity in reverberating circuits. So in the after discharge, I have told you reverberating circuits are responsible, and also the prolonged changes in excitability are possible because of reverberating circuits or prolonged effects of synaptic mediators. So when the central excitatory state is marked, excitatory impulses irradiate not only to many somatic areas of spinal cord but also to autonomic areas. So in addition to the somatic, the autonomic reflexes or autonomic functions are also activated when there is central excitatory state. That is, for example, if you take a chronic paraplegic human, that is a paralysis patient, when a mild painful stimulus is given, in addition to prolonged withdrawal extension pattern in all the four limbs, there will be other autonomic functions, that is urination, defecation, sweating, and blood pressure fluctuations are also seen. So this is an example of mass reflex. And some other properties of reflexes are also present, like convergence of many neurons to one projection, and also divergence, that is one to many projections are also seen in the reflexes, and facilitation, that is the when many afferent neurons projecting on the single motor neurons are stimulated, simultaneously the motor neuron is activated, causing facilitation, and inhibition is decrease in activities of target neurons. That is the reciprocal inhibition. We have seen in our properties of synapses, Renshaw cell inhibition. So that example also comes here, inhibition of reflexes. And summation of reflexes is also present, same like synapses summation, spatial and temporal. And occlusion, habituation, and sensitization. So same explanations as for synapses are also considered here for reflexes. Okay, so if the properties of reflexes comes as a short question, you should write all those. Okay, starting with adequate stimulus, final common pathway, central excitatory and inhibitory states, and convergence, divergence, facilitation, inhibition, summation, occlusion, habituation, and sensitization. So these are the properties of reflexes. So in today's class, we have seen the introduction to reflexes. So what is a spinal reflex, and then the reflexes maintaining the posture of the body, that is the stretch reflex, inverse stretch reflex, withdrawal reflex, crossed extensor reflex, and also lastly we have seen the properties of reflexes. And in middle we have seen the higher control of stretch reflex, that is facilitatory and inhibitory areas. So that picture, the slides which are in blue color, that is very important. Okay, and also take the assignment for today's class. So write neatly the stretch reflex, draw the diagram and explain stretch reflex, only stretch reflex. Okay. So thank you all.